Hey everybody, Pastor Matt here. I want us to take a look at a midweek sermon takeaway from the passage we looked at on Sunday, which was Romans 8:18 to 25. And that passage was dealing with suffering, but also the hope that we can have in the midst of our suffering. All of us are going through a particular type of suffering, and we may end up going through a type of suffering that we're not quite understanding why. And it could be suffering from within. It could be suffering from a mental, emotional, physical aspect. It could be wondering why things are going on in the culture, why things are going on in our family. And that can bring about, and as Tim Keller was talking about, kind of an implosion on us to where all we can see is the suffering and the hurt, and we're having a hard time seeing anything else. While we didn't go over all of that on Sunday, I think it's important for us to make sure that we're dealing with the fact that not all suffering looks alike, and not all solutions to this suffering all look alike. What may work well for one person and mean a lot for one person may not be that way for another person. So I guess what I want to talk about this time is how we help people through it. So the first point from this past Sunday is that you've got to see your suffering in light of glory. And that's where it's where Paul says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the Son of God." And so that word "consider," we can become so absorbed with our feelings and so absorbed with the circumstances and how we're reacting to those feelings that we have to move our minds to consider, or some of your versions may say to reckon. We've got to continually remind ourselves and to be considering what is ahead of us. The way that people who are enduring persecution, like in Western Africa or in China or in India, is that they see the glory that is to come. They know that all of this is temporary. 2 Corinthians 4:16 to 18, it talks about that these light momentary afflictions are setting up a weight of glory beyond all comparison as we look to the things that are not seen. Right? Not to the things that are seen, but we look to the things that are not seen. The things that are seen are temporary. The things that are not seen are eternal. But he starts off with this phrase, "Therefore we do not lose heart." Jesus even said that in John 14, "Let not your hearts be troubled," when he found out that Jesus would be going away and one of the disciples would betray him, one of the disciples would deny him. And so this grief, this agony began to engulf them all. And this is why Jesus kept, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, this is why Jesus kept moving to help them realize they wouldn't be alone. The Holy Spirit would be there with them, and that what is happening right now in creation and what's happening right now with others, with humanity, is a temporary deal. But that gives us a bit more of an urgency to be able to make sure that we're telling people about this glory and about this hope. And that's another passage or another phrase that kept coming up was "in hope, in hope, in hope." We go through this because in hope of the things that are to come. Let me talk about hope real quick, because there's a hope that we talk about, like when a birthday or Christmas party comes up. "Oh, I hope I got this. I hope my kids come home to see us. I hope, I hope, I hope." That is a desire that's coupled with uncertainty. We don't know if that's going to happen. The hope that Jesus is talking about is a hope that is coupled with certainty. The moment God gives a promise about something, then that hope we have is coupled with certainty. It's linked with that certainty that it's going to come about because God gives a promise and God makes a covenant based upon his character. And his character is one where he is in authority, he is in power, he will run things the way that they need to be run. I told you about an illustration, and I just want to share it again with you because Martin Luther, the great reformer, he lived from the late 1400s into the mid 1500s. He was the great reformer that brought the church back to the gospel. But he was in a valley. He was just in a really, really low valley, depressed as he was prone to be. And his wife, Katerina, woke up and the next morning and had an armband a black armband, which represented that someone had died around her left arm. And Luther was asking her, well, who died? And she said, well, the way that you're acting, it's like God died. God's still on his throne. And while we all know that, and that may not immediately alleviate the suffering, it is an anchor that we have in the midst of it all. In the midst of it all. And God will give us the strength as the needs come about and as the issues come along, as we see them. Now, before we get into them, we may not realize that. But as we get into them, then we begin to realize that God is giving us strength to be able to help us to get through. The second point was that know that creation groans until the glory is revealed. The third point, that we Christians too groan, but that we do this with lots and lots of hope. John Gray, who wrote the book Straw Dogs, it's hard to say, but he said that religious cultures could admit that earthly life was hard, for they promised another in which all tears would be wiped away. Their humanist successors affirmed something still more incredible, that in the future, even the near future, everyone can be happy. Societies founded on faith and progress cannot but admit normal unhappiness in human life. So when we're Christians and we are really digging into what the Bible has to say, we recognize that suffering is not something that is abnormal in this world, that suffering is part of this world, that something is not abnormal in our hearts, which is what the culture would say, and in our minds, but that suffering is actually a part of it. And therefore, we lean into that knowing that there is that happy day to come. And that's where most of our hymns, why we treasure them so much. Trials dark on every hand, and we cannot understand all the ways that God would lead us to that blessed promised land. But he'll guide us with his eye, and we'll follow till we die, and we'll understand it better by and by. See, that's a song, that's a hymn that is filled with hope of what's to come. And it develops and helps develop in us a bit of patience in us. 2 Corinthians 1:9, indeed, we felt that we had received a sentence of death, but that it was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. So suffering brings along and comes alongside us to say, look, you can't rely on the things of this world. You can't even rely on yourself, but there is an anchor that you can rely on. And however God takes you through that valley of the shadow of death, the one constant is he'll be with us. He'll be with us. He'll be with us. He'll be with us. And that's what you have to understand. That's what you have to realize. Let me close with the poem that I read to you at the end of the service. And you may have already heard this at some other point, but I think this is a great way for us to end. It says this: my life is but a weaving between my God and me. I cannot choose the colors, he weaveth steadily. Oft times he weaveth sorrow, and I in foolish pride forget he sees the upper, and I the underside. The dark threads are as needful in the weaver's skillful hand as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern he has planned. Not till the loom is silent and the shuttles cease to fly will God unroll the canvas and reveal the reason why. That's why those hymns, we'll understand it better by and by. In the sweet by and by, we'll understand it better by and by. That is something that we need to be holding on to. So if you're struggling, if you're suffering, I want you to realize that things are moving toward a conclusion, but we've got to be ready ourselves. We've got to make sure that we're not, that as things are moving toward this final consummation, that we ourselves are leaning on Christ with everything that we have, that we rush to the cross, because there we may not know exactly how it all transpired and how God did it, but we know that he did it and that suffering has purpose and suffering has meaning. It's not devoid and it's not arbitrary. And as you run to the cross and you run to the empty tomb, you see the suffering has a purpose, but you also see the victory that was procured by Christ on the cross. Let me know what you think. Send me some feedback and let me know if there's stories you have about how God has helped you navigate through suffering and to be able to reestablish that hope that he has given to you. Talk to you soon.